In the summer of 1887, a 7-year-old girl walked out of the Smoky Mountain wilderness alone, barefoot, and speaking a language no linguist at the University of Tennessee could identify. Her name, as she would later give it, was Ora. She carried nothing except a carved bone fragment, roughly 11 inches long, etched with symbols that 3 separate academic institutions declared pre-Columbian in origin, possibly pre-contact Mississippian, but structurally unlike anything cataloged. That bone sat in a cedar box in the Smithsonian's restricted archive for 66 years. It was not misplaced. It was filed under a category that, as of 1953, no longer officially existed. That is where the story begins. Not with folklore, not with legend, with a document that was physically in the building, dated, signed, witnessed, and then quietly reclassified into a storage wing that the public index did not acknowledge until a graduate student named Helen Rauch stumbled across a misfiled inventory manifest in 1951. I found this while researching something else entirely, actually, a separate thread about Appalachian ethnographic surveys conducted between 1880 and 1910. And then Ora's name appeared once in a footnote with no corresponding source citation. Just a name and a year.
Wait,
that was enough.
here it
The
is.
Smoky Mountains do not give things up easily. They fold geography into themselves like a blanket pulled over something still
But
breathing. Valleys
there's
disappear
no
from topographic
source
view.
citation
Ridgelines look
for
identical
this
from 4
name.
different angles. And the communities that lived deepest in those mountains in the 19th century, the ones who had been there longest, who had refused removal or simply evaded it, they understood that invisibility was survival. What happened to Ora and to whoever raised her has to be understood in that context first. The official story goes like this. In late July of 1887, a farmer named Caleb Purvis, working land near the Oconaluftee River watershed in what is now Swain County, North Carolina, encountered a child sitting beside a creek. She appeared healthy, well-fed, and calm, not frightened. That detail would be noted repeatedly by everyone who encountered her during the following weeks. She was never frightened. Purvis brought her to his homestead, and his wife attempted communication over several days. The girl responded to sounds, but not to English, not to Cherokee, not to any of the regional dialects that Mrs. Purvis, a lifelong mountain resident, recognized. A Methodist missionary named Aldous Crane was summoned. He had moderate experience with the eastern band of Cherokee and spoke passable Tsalagi. The girl did not respond to it. What she did respond to, apparently, were very low, sustained vocal tones, humming, essentially. Mrs. Purvis reportedly discovered this by accident one evening while singing a slow hymn in the kitchen. The child came from the other room and stood in the doorway listening with what witnesses described as recognition, not wonder. That distinction was recorded explicitly. Someone in that room understood the difference between a child hearing something new and a child hearing something familiar. Let me be fair to the official narrative. The subsequent government documentation on Ora's case was not malicious in its framing. The Bureau of Indian Affairs assessed her and concluded she was likely the child of an isolated Cherokee family, possibly from a community that had retreated deep enough into the mountains to avoid the various removal pressures of the preceding decades and developed linguistic drift over generations. This is plausible. This is genuinely plausible. Linguistic isolation can produce measurable divergence within 4 or 5 generations under extreme conditions, and the late 19th century Southern Appalachians held communities so remote that federal census takers simply stopped trying to document them. The BIA filed her case. She was placed with a Quaker family in Maryville, Tennessee, learned English within 14 months, which several observers noted was unusually rapid, and was eventually enrolled in a school. She became, by all surviving accounts, quiet, intelligent, and never fully at ease in any large gathering. She was also, by her own later testimony, adamant about one thing from the very beginning. She had not come from a family. She had come from people who were not a family in any sense she could translate. Let's start with the numbers. Ora gave 4 formal recorded testimonies over the course of her life, in 1901, 1919, 1931, and finally in 1952, the year before she died. The 1901 account was taken by a folklorist affiliated with the American Folklore Society named Charles Morley. It is 6 pages long. The 1919 account, recorded by a journalist whose name appears on the document but who has no other verifiable professional trace anywhere in contemporary press archives, runs to 22 pages. The 1931 account, taken by a man identified only as Dr. F. Hargrove, affiliated with the Bureau of Ethnological Studies, is documented as existing but has never been released. And the 1952 testimony, transcribed by Helen Rauch herself, was sealed upon submission to the Smithsonian and not made accessible until a partial release in 1953, months after Ora died. The timeline isn't subtle. The 1919 account, the longest, the most detailed, was given to a journalist who, as far as anyone has determined, published nothing from it and appears in no newspaper masthead, no press guild record, no city directory in Tennessee, Virginia, or North Carolina for that entire decade. 22 pages of testimony. Vanished. The document itself exists in photocopy form, discovered by Rauch among the misfiled inventory materials. But the journalist? Gone. The original manuscript? Unlocated. Speaking of the 1931 account, and this is where the pattern starts pressing harder, a Dr. F. Hargrove does appear in federal employment records, but under a department designation that was reorganized out of existence in 1935 during a consolidation of ethnographic agencies under the New Deal administrative restructuring. His personnel file exists. His published academic work does not. And the Bureau of Ethnological Studies, as a named entity, shows up in exactly 3 documents spanning 1927 to 1934, and in none of the official agency records of the Smithsonian, the Bureau of American Ethnology, or any university department. Which brings me to what Ora actually said. The 1952 testimony, the one Rauch transcribed, the one partially released, is not sensational. That's the first thing that strikes you reading it. Ora was, by then, 62 years old, and she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades deciding exactly which words to use. She described the people who raised her as tall, very tall. She gave no numerical estimate because, as she said directly, I had no numbers for it then, and the comparison I would give you now would only be my adult mind trying to make sense of a child's memory, and I will not do that to you. She was, in other words, explicitly protecting the integrity of her own recollection. That is not the behavior of someone embellishing. She described them as living in an arrangement she called dwelling together but not near, multiple habitations within a territory, but not clustered, dispersed. She described a form of communication that was primarily tonal, low frequency, sustained, similar in structure to the humming that Mrs. Purvis had first noticed. She described a diet she could only partially articulate, involving specific fungi, roots, and what she called prepared water that she believed was somehow treated or filtered through materials she couldn't identify as a child. She described no fire, not the absence of fire, the deliberate non-use of it. But here's what matters most. She described leaving not as abandonment, not as being sent away, but as being, and this is her exact word in the transcript, graduated. She said it calmly. She said it twice. She was graduated from that place, and the bone fragment she carried out was given to her as a record. Not a gift, a record. She said she was told, in whatever way communication happened among them, that the record should reach people who collected such things, because a time was getting closer when the record would matter. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but the bone fragment was tested, informally and without full methodology disclosure, by 3 separate parties between 1887 and 1951. The first assessment, conducted at the University of Tennessee within weeks of Ora's emergence, described the carvings as regular and deliberate, suggesting tool use and intentional symbolic arrangement. The second, conducted by an unnamed Smithsonian staff member around 1920, noted striking formal similarity to known pre-contact woodland and Mississippian iconographic traditions. but with structural elements that do not correspond to any documented cultural tradition in the Eastern North American record. The third assessment, by Rauch herself in 1951 before the fragment was resealed, observed that the bone appeared to have been treated with a preservative compound she could not identify, something that had kept it supple and undegraded for what the material itself suggested were potentially several centuries. Several centuries. If Ora was born in 1880, roughly, she did not carve that bone. Someone gave it to her. Someone who had kept it or made it well before her birth. And whoever did that was still alive in 1887, or had been very recently, because she walked out of those mountains carrying it, calm, well-fed, and unafraid. Let's follow the thread further back. In 1823, a trapper named Solomon Greer filed a deposition with the Buncombe County Court in North Carolina following a dispute over land boundaries. The deposition is mundane for most of its length, but in the middle of it, entirely as contextual evidence for establishing where he had been and when, Greer describes spending 2 nights near what he called the High People, a group he encountered in a narrow valley that he declined to name, who traded with him in low vocalizations and hand gestures, gave him salted meat of a type he said he'd never tasted before or since, and who were, in his words, of extraordinary height and unusual stillness. He estimated them at 7 to 8 feet tall. He did not seem frightened of them. He traded goods, rested, and moved on. That deposition is real. It exists in the Buncombe County Historical Records Archive. It was noted in passing by a historian of Appalachian economic history in 1967, who mentioned it in a footnote as an example of exaggerated frontier folklore. No further follow-up was conducted. In 1901, a Cherokee elder named Adai, interviewed by Charles Morley, the same man who later took Ora's first formal testimony, described a group within traditional oral knowledge that the Eastern Band called, roughly transliterated, those who remain in the high places. Adai was careful to distinguish them from ancestral spirits or supernatural beings. He was insistent on that point. They were not spirits. They were flesh. They were old. And they had, in his telling, an arrangement with certain Cherokee communities, a mutual recognition, an understood boundary, a protocol of non-interference that both groups honored. He said that arrangement had been largely intact since before anyone's grandmother's grandmother could remember. The timing is almost theatrical. Ora emerges in 1887. Her bone fragment is quietly filed away. Her most detailed testimony disappears into the hands of a journalist who cannot be verified. Her 1931 testimony is taken by an official connected to a bureau that effectively vanishes from record 4 years later. And when she finally gives her last full account at 62 to a graduate student who has the intellectual courage to actually write it down and submit it formally, it is sealed for public release. Sealed, then partially released after her death. Maybe the BIA assessment was correct and Ora was simply a child from a deeply isolated community whose linguistic isolation had become extreme enough to seem foreign even to other Cherokee speakers. Maybe the tall people she remembered were a child's memory, distorted by perspective. Adults always appear massive to very young children, and a community of large-statured individuals would seem enormous. Maybe Solomon Greer was embellishing for color and the court recorder simply transcribed it faithfully without editorial skepticism. Maybe the linguists at the University of Tennessee were wrong about the language being unidentifiable, and the truth was more ordinary, a dialectal drift so severe it resembled a separate tongue. Maybe the bone fragment was carved by someone with unusual skill working within a tradition that simply hasn't been documented yet, because the Eastern North American archaeological record is incomplete and full of such gaps. Maybe the journalist who conducted the 1919 interview was a freelancer using a pseudonym who simply never published the piece and whose real identity would be utterly boring to discover. Maybe, but the pattern of disappearance is not maybes. Documents do not routinely vanish across 4 separate testimonies over 50 years. Official associations do not routinely dissolve in ways that prevent retrospective verification. Bone fragments carved in recognizable artistic traditions do not routinely contain structural elements that resist classification by multiple independent experts across multiple decades. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What was being managed here was not aura. Aura was never the subject of concern. The subject of concern was the record she carried, literally and figuratively. What she knew, what she could describe, what the bone fragment, properly analyzed, might confirm or deny. The partial 1953 release of her testimony was based on what Rauch later wrote in a private letter, itself discovered in the Rauch family papers held by a small Tennessee library, edited. Rauch said explicitly, in that letter dated September 1953 to an unnamed colleague, that approximately 40% of the testimony she transcribed was not included in the released version. She described the excluded material as the specific portions relating to numbers, how many, how long, where, numbers, duration, location, the three things you would want to suppress if you were managing knowledge of a living population. Not a historical population, a living one. Aura herself, in the portion of the transcript that was released, said something that has stayed with me since I first read it. She was asked by Rauch whether she believed the people who raised her were still in the mountains. She paused, and Rauch noted the pause explicitly, said it lasted long enough to become conspicuous. And then Aura said, "I don't believe they would leave. They have never had reason to leave. The mountains are sufficient, and the mountains are very old, and they are very patient, and so are those people." Then she said nothing more on the subject. That was 1952. The Smoky Mountain Wilderness, even today, contains areas that have never been systematically surveyed on foot. Federal wilderness designations have, since the 1960s, placed substantial portions of the high backcountry beyond the reach of development and limited even research access under certain protocols. The reasons given are ecological preservation, which they may well be. But the National Park Service's internal communications from the 1940s and 1950s, available through Freedom of Information requests, though many are heavily redacted, include, among the routine maintenance correspondence and budget discussions, several references to what is termed the Prior Occupancy Acknowledgement Protocol. This protocol, from what the unredacted portions allow, involved specific procedures for certain backcountry rangers who reported unusual encounters in the high elevation zones. The procedures included reporting chains that bypassed normal supervisory structures and went instead to a specific Washington office whose function is not named in the visible text. I am not telling you giants live in the Appalachians. I am telling you that a 7-year-old girl walked out of those mountains in 1887 carrying a bone that experts couldn't explain, speaking sounds that linguists couldn't categorize, and that she spent 65 years trying carefully, deliberately, and with remarkable restraint to tell people exactly what she had witnessed, and that every single formal attempt to record and preserve her testimony encountered obstruction, dissolution, or disappearance in ways that required either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate management. Helen Rauch died in 1979. The private letter to her unnamed colleague was found tucked inside a copy of Franz Boas's Anthropology and Modern Life in her personal library. The 40% of Aura's testimony that was never released has not been located. The cedar box that once held the bone fragment is listed in the Smithsonian's 1953 Inventory Manifest as transferred to a storage facility in Suitland, Maryland. The fragment itself is listed as no longer present in associated housing. Location, not specified. Status, not specified. Somewhere in a ridge-heavy wilderness older than any written record of this continent. Something very patient has been waiting for the right time to be understood. Aura knew what it was. She spent her whole life saying so, as plainly as she could, to anyone willing to hold still long enough to listen. Nobody listened. Or, and this is the thought I cannot shake on the quiet nights when I have been sitting with this story too long. Maybe somebody did.